thank you, and welcome. And thanks, Raf, for the nice introduction. Welcome to my talk about the statistical consequences of fat beats. Topic today is to explore the dynamics of audio signals. To establish that by dynamics I mean basically the difference between loud parts and soft parts of music and all the instruments within music. Why is it interesting to explore that in a statistical way? It's because basically critical listening is hard, let's admit that. Critical listening is when you, as an audio engineer or as a mastering engineer, are listening to stuff, trying to find out what does it sound like in a reliable way, and how do I want it to sound, and how do I get from here to there. And that's critical listening. But the ears are very subjective. It depends on how well you slept, what you've heard before, how long you've been working. So you need some help with that to have a more reliable idea of what you're doing at all. And for that, metering tools are something that can help. And first, let's look at some existing metering tools that I guess are well known. First of all, maybe the spectrum analyzer, which shows kind of what happens across frequencies, how much high and low frequencies are there in the signal. Then you have something that's more about levels, RMS meter or peak meter, that shows you some information about, or to get an idea of how loud is a signal, but it's also not really reliable. And then you have something more advanced, which tries to be a perceptive model of loudness, how loudness is actually perceived. It's the LUFS metering technique. These techniques all have something in common. They either show values that are changing all the time, or they are showing an average over a longer time. And in both cases, you don't really see what's really going on. And a lot of information is lost in this process due to the averaging and due to the changing all the time. And when I see something that's averaged over a longer time, or, well, did it drop out? Okay, that's averaged over a long time, I think, okay, if it's something interesting, there might be something that generates this average, and it might be interesting to look at it. And the idea I had, I borrowed kind of from image processing. So if you are familiar with tools like Photoshop or something like that, in image processing, you often see something like this in these tools. A histogram, which is basically a statistic of the brightnesses in all the pixels in the image. So what this shows is it counts. At the very left, this graph shows how many of the pixels in the image are pitch black. On the very right, it is how many of the pixels are completely white. And for all the brightness levels in between, it kind of counts how many pixels are this bright. And that's the statistic you get. And you can get a lot of information about the image by looking at this. If you have, as in this case, a very broad distribution, it means you have a very dynamic picture with lots of different brightnesses in it. If it's a kind of gray on black vector image or something, you would get peaks there because you don't have a lot of different colors and brightnesses in the image. And what you also can do with a lot of these tools is you can even take this statistic and manipulate it. And To the right here, we can see such a tool where you can define a curve to manipulate in a nonlinear way the brightnesses in the image. And in this case, it would increase the contrast in the middle gray regions and decrease the contrast in the very dark and very light regions. And by doing that, you can, for example, make an image look more dramatic. So that's something that kind of inspired me to do something similar with audio. And something similar to brightness in audio is loudness. So what I need to do now is I need to make these statistics over something that's closely related to loudness as it is perceived. And so here's how I compute that actually. It's basically also inspired by the LUFS metering method. And first of all, the signal that you have is going through a K-weighting filter, a so-called K-weighting filter, which aims to compensate for some frequency-dependent sensitivities of the ear. So what comes out of this filter is kind of closer to what the hearing is actually sensitive for. What then follows is basically an RMS follower. You square the signal samples, then there's a low-pass filter with a very low cutoff frequency of 10 Hertz. It's below the range of human hearing, and that way you can average over the very short time, in this case a time resolution of 100 milliseconds, which is also proposed in the LUFS metering. And then that value is converted to decibels, because that's kind of proportional to how humans perceive loudness. You could do a much more sophisticated model out of all of this, but this is as simple as possible, but no simpler. And from those values that come out of this chain, I generate a histogram. And for the next parts, we'll look at several of those measurements for actual recorded music, full mastered music, as well as individual tracks. And first, a word about the example that I've used. I thought it didn't make really sense to use any samples that I create on my own, because that would probably be weird and it wouldn't make a point. So I've selected a couple of different genres and different epochs in music history, music that has at some point been bought by people. So that's the criterion. People should have been willing to pay money to listen to this music that I'm using here as examples. As this is all copyrighted material, I can't play snippets now, because otherwise the ADC people might get in trouble. But I've uploaded some of the audio samples to the link you see here. And after the talk, or if you're streaming, you may want to press pause. If you don't know the songs, you can listen to them to get an idea of what we are seeing here. And you can also download the slides there to look at the graphs again. So I'll first start with kind of the big picture and look at complete music recordings as they are on CD, and we'll also go forward a bit chronologically in a brief history of dynamics. Let's start with earlier examples of music, but first I need to explain, I guess, what you are seeing here in this graph. In comparison to what you've seen on the image processing slide before, I've put this upside down for a reason, because when I've shown such graphs to people in the horizontal way, they would always think it's about frequency, but it's not. Here on the y-axis is basically the loudness measurement that comes out of this detection chain, and the density or the actual histogram is on the x-axis here. And I've also added for reference the LUFS value computed from these recordings as the dashed lines you see there. And the first example I want to talk about is the classical piece here by Johann Strauss. And classical music is known to be very dynamic, to be something where if you record it and produce a CD of a classical concert, you try to not mess with anything at all. And thus, you get here a very broad image that shows, okay, there's a lot of dynamics in this. There's a lot of very soft parts in that piece. There's also quite loud parts in that piece, and there's a lot of stuff happening. Quite different is the example from Herbie Hancock piece here. It starts to show kind of a peak in this distribution. And you can say kind of, okay, this is kind of characteristic to a band playing a song. As I would call it, band music kind of has usually some kind of loudness point where it's happening around. But still, this peak or this, let's call it a mountain, is quite broad. So if we look now to some later examples, you will see that this is comparably dynamic. So let's fast forward a bit to the mid-80s. And here we can see, okay, something happened culturally. I would say for two reasons. If you have very dynamic recordings and you're listening anywhere, and I would guess that's something that started probably in the 80s, that music was more ubiquitous and you are listening to music kind of everywhere in the car, or maybe with one of the first Walkmans on the street. The soft parts of music would get buried kind of in the surrounding noise. Music production techniques started to advance towards compressing dynamics more, and thus creating less dynamic overall mixes, but that also has an upside. So I won't comment on on what's better or worse, but it has the advantage that the softer parts or the details in these recordings are more present, even if you are listening in a very noisy environment or something. But the second reason for that is also that, as we all probably know, at some point record companies discovered that they can sell more records if these records are louder. So if a song is played on the radio and it's louder than the others that's on the radio, then there was kind of, you could show, okay, it's more likely that the louder song is bought, because louder automatically, if you don't adjust for it, means better. Record companies started to say to studios and engineers, okay, we need to be louder than our competition. And that ended more or less like this. We are now in 2011 and 2013. A song by the Foo Fighters, which is basically a wall of guitars, and a track by John Hopkins, which is a wall of bass, I would say. And these are even louder and even more compressed. You get this narrow peak and not a lot of information in this distribution anymore. So one could also say, if I take an average of this reading here, it tells me most about the dynamics. There's not much information, at least in this way of doing the graph left. So these are two tracks that I would say still sound really good, even though they are really loud. And nevertheless, this is loudness war territory, the region here above. You can find certainly songs that have these peaks even narrower and even higher. But that's probably also something that doesn't sound very good anymore. So what we've seen now is a very, very broad overview of a complete song. But the song is always a sum of a lot of parts. So after this, I'd like to zoom in a bit more and just do the same with individual tracks. Because that's something that can be quite relevant in actual music production. I found from some remix contest years ago some single tracks from a track by Jamiroquai, Too Young to Die. And so let's look at some of these tracks here. First, we have the drums and percussion, which are percussive instruments, have a lot of silence or pauses in between them. They are not like a pad sound from a synth, something that carries on, but it's always percussive. So you get a lot of dynamics in such drum and percussion recordings. And something interesting we see also here is that there are basically two modes for this drum bass. In the region here on the top, that's where the kick and snare happen, which are the fundament kind of the beat. And if you take away the kick and snare, you would be left with this part here, which are a lot of hi-hat and ghost notes from the snare, all this all this softer stuff that happens in between and that makes the track really interesting. If we go on here with the bass, the bass in this case is supposed to lay a foundation in the song. And thus it shouldn't have a lot of variation in loudness. It should always be there together with the drums, and that's what we see here. It's a far narrower peak, and it is probably compressed already in this recording track. And quite similarly, the Rhodes piano, it most of the time lays chords under the kind of as a pad into the song. But you also have some regions with some more dynamic things happening, and the picture is starting to become a bit crowded. But if we add now also the guitar, which in this song is a very soft, funky, it consists basically solely of ghost notes in this song. And then you have the lead vocals, which should be less dynamic and on top, because they also always should stick out of the song. If we look at this concept, we can kind of get to the notion of if I'm making a mix and I have this kind of picture in mind, I can make a concept and I can have a conversation about how I want to build up this mix. how dynamic should or could some of the instruments be, and where should they sit in this dynamic space that we have here. We'll see later how this might be used for fun and profit. But so far, what we've seen here is mainly the statistics over the complete song. But similarly to the song has tracks, but a song also has different parts. It has choruses, verses, bridges, and whatever, and these may be different. So it makes sense to have a look at how this how these dynamic distributions, I call them, evolve over the course of a complete song. I'm doing that by making these statistics, these distributions over and over a shorter time frame of, let's say, two seconds, and then showing how it evolves over time. So for reference, I've also added the waveform view in this case here, because we are probably familiar with that from any DAW that we can see. And below we can see this distribution over time now. So it's still the y-axis is the level and the statistic distribution, and then we have the time axis. And here we can see the full extent to what a classical recording is like. There's a lot of different parts with very different loudnesses, but within most of these parts, it's kind of it's kind of focused. So what you kind of see here is what the orchestra considers as pianissimo, piano, mezzo, and whatever you have, up to some fortissimo here. And that's very characteristic of classical recordings. Whereas with the Herbie Hancock piece, we can see here that there are a bit of differences between some parts. Some parts are a bit softer and some are a bit louder, but that's about it. It kind of meanders around some shared consideration of how loud is this song. But you also see these cloudy structures here. There are parts which are dynamic, where you have these clouds, and then everyone plays a bit louder in this part, for example. Yeah, these are still the examples we've seen before for quite dynamic recordings. And let's follow up with the loudness war. Here it starts to converge already to some kind of straight line. Although there are parts that are a bit softer in general, but you have no more clouds. So that's what we've seen before. At some point, this started to be a development culturally, and it gets even more focused in the newer sound examples. And of course, we are doing this over and over now for all these tracks. So we'll look at these kinds of diagrams now again for the individual tracks. And here you can see again, okay, there's not much variation in the dynamics in the drums. But one interesting thing we can see here, there's probably a limiter at play that kind of limits the kick and snare at this minus 10 dB, minus 11 dB level. With the percussion bass, you can see a bit more that there's parts where the percussion go more all in, especially towards the end. There's some more stuff happening, and that way you can get a bit of an overview over the song. And I'd really like to have this kind of view in a DAW. So here again, the bass is also quite level all the way. For the Rhodes, you can identify several different parts this way, and I think that's a quite useful view. And similarly for the guitar and the lead vocals, we can have this overview of what's happening in the song. But I'd like to show one more of these kinds of images now. So what I've done before is I segmented the song in time. And now we squeeze it back in time, make a statistic over the whole song, but we segment it into frequency space and show how these dynamic distributions look across different frequencies over the whole song. So here again, really dynamic older examples. The classical piece is just as dynamic as it gets in kind of all the frequency ranges here. Whereas you can see something that's quite characteristic of most, I would say, band music. You have a narrower distribution in the lower frequencies and more dynamics in the higher frequencies here. So that's mainly because in the lower frequencies you have things that build the fundament of a song. The fundamental notes that the bass plays, and the kick is also quite important in just keeping the song together, and all the information that makes it really interesting is happening in the higher frequencies there. And of course, loudness war is happening all across the board here. Again, we see that for these much louder recordings, this starts to converge to a much more narrow and much more focused picture here. And we can also see some characteristic differences between these two songs. But we would need to listen to it now to go deeper into what that is. The difference becomes more obvious in these examples here. Again, we have this Wall of Guitars song by the Foo Fighters, which kind of converges to a very focused line here. There's not much left. Whereas with the similarly loud John Hopkins track here, which I call the Wall of Bass, you have the loudness or these decreased dynamics, these focused dynamics are dominated by the bass frequencies. Whereas for the higher frequencies, there's a lot happening still. So this track kind of saved up all this dynamic space for the higher frequencies. And that's probably one reason why it works quite well. So, and you may already guess it. We're now doing this with the individual tracks again, in order to get a vision of mapping out a mix, this time in 2D. Again, drum bass and percussion bass, we can argue probably that these complement each other quite well in this mix. We have again the kick range, and we have all this hi-hat stuff here, and some focused or less less loud snare in the middle, similar to the percussion. You can also see some of the resonances of the congas here, which generate these peaks. If we now add to that picture the bass and Rhodes, you can see, okay, these instruments kind of have their space in the mix, both in terms of frequency and where they happen dynamically. So the Rhodes is focused in these mid frequencies, while the bass is in the low frequencies, obviously, and you have some of the more dynamic stuff happening here, which are the fret noises and the slap noises and so on. Right between the bass and the Rhodes, we see the main part of the distribution of the guitar. So it fits quite nicely in the mix here. And then we also have the vocals, which are kind of over the higher 2/3 of the frequency spectrum, and that's the job of vocals. They kind of sit above the other stuff, so they stick out well in the final mix. So enough of these static pictures. We get a bit towards the end, and we've seen a lot of static pictures that I made of this music, but my original vision was, of course, to turn this idea into a practical application, and that's what I'm showing now. It's a plugin I'm working on. You see a prototype here, and it's based around the idea, what would dynamic processing look like today if nobody had ever invented the compressor? So what you see here is basically a way to manipulate these dynamic distributions that I've shown. On the left side, it shows these measurements in kind of a real time over some time that you can adjust. And on the right side, there's the output distribution, and in the middle you have these handles to manipulate it. But to better explain how that actually works, I've made a little video that I'm showing now. Okay.
Hi, I'm going to show you a quick demo of my upcoming plugin called Dynamic Grading. I've made a little drum track here using one of Logic's stock drum kits. Nothing special, a fat rock kit with some nice room to it. The track as it is still quite raw and dynamic, and much of it would be buried in a busy mix. I'll be using dynamic grading to shape the dynamics of it. Let's have a look. The flashing Christmas tree you see here shows in real time the dynamic distributions of the input to the left and the output to the right. The length of the bars shows the statistics over the last 20 seconds, while the flashing shows what happens in the last 100 milliseconds. That way I can see what instruments in the track contribute to which parts of the distribution. For example, in the area up here, I see mainly the kick and snare, while further down here I have the hi-hats and part of the room response. Now I can use these handles here to shape the dynamics to my liking. On the left side, I'll first move them to mark a few significant points. With the handles on the right side, I can move these reference points to define what I want the distribution to be like. I like cheesy 80s pop music, so by squeezing the hi-hat range closer to the kick and snare, I get that nice Phil Collins style fatness. But that also brought the room reverb up more than I'd like. To mitigate that, I'll stretch the lower end back down a bit to get a drier overall sound. Nice! I'll also tame the transients a little bit to get some more headroom while making sure it stays punchy enough. Now I've created the distribution I like, I'll finally adjust the overall level a bit. In this case, I want to center my mix roughly just above the -30 dB mark, which I found is a good ballpark to arrange the different instrument tracks around. Of course, I already prepared that.
Thank you, thank you. So that's dynamic grading. I hope to get it ready early next year. You may have noticed it's not exactly what I would call beautiful yet. I'm looking for someone to help me with the user interface. So maybe if one of you is into that, we might talk later. Yeah, so just to conclude, in order to get some nice ideas like this, if you see an average and it's about something interesting, it might pay off to take a look at the distribution behind it. And with that, I'm at the end. Thank you very much. You can follow some of the progress I'm making with this on my website, and also if you follow me via Twitter. And yeah, I think we have some time for questions. Thank you.
Hold on, there we go. All right, we're gonna take some questions real quick. I got one online that I'm gonna do real quick, and then I'm gonna bounce around the room. So let's get that one out of the way. Let's see. This one is Andres. He says, have you ever tried the free VST plugin Slick HDR by Variety of Sound? That was meant to be STG-like, an equivalent of HDR for audio, balancing micro and macro dynamics.
I haven't tried that particular one yet, I guess. It rings a bell. I might have looked at it, but I can't say anything about it.
Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna go around the room. I'm gonna start on this side and go back, but keep in mind that we want to give him a good name for his plugin. Okay.
Yes.
All right, yeah, we gotta do that. Say out loud.
Was the Peter Gabriel track that you used a remaster or the original version?
Was the Peter Gabriel track the original or a remaster, and have you done anything to compare those?
As far as I know, it's the original. I haven't tried to get an original CD or to make sure it really is. Short answer, I'm not sure, but I think it's not.
Okay. Yeah. A question on this side right here.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering, you seem to be using kind of discrete segments to detect the levels and assign them to one of the statistical buckets, and I wondered how you avoided kind of amplitude modulation artifacts from trying to follow that and force the levels to the right.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah,
in a concise way. Discrete versus continuous.
Yeah, I'll show the slide again. So what you mean is the discrete levels, these bars here, and if I have any problems regarding modulation, amplitude modulation, when I manipulate these buckets, the thing is the modulation is continuous, the processing is continuous, and these discrete buckets are just there for the display and for the statistics. Yeah.
I think we had another question on this side right here somewhere. Another question? Yes? No? Maybe? Questions? No questions over here?
Nope.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll put one back over there.
Yeah.
So the question is how quick those responses change over time, right? Or how quick and is that interesting?
I'm not sure I understand the question right. I'll try to explain what this short and long window parameter here means. Probably makes sense to reiterate that. The long window is kind of what generates the statistic, which is the length of the bars, the long-term statistic. And the short window is what does the flashing. So I have a method of looking, the snare comes and I see this part light up. So I can see, okay, the snare contributes mostly to this part of the distribution, and the hi-hats, when I hear them and it flashes here, I can see, okay, this is where the hi-hats contribute. It makes sense, of course, to play around with these values, how it works. It also depends probably a bit on the material, how meaningful it is. So it's probably for a good overview of a part, it might be fully sufficient to do the statistics over like 2, 4, 8 bars and set this here. Obviously, the longer you set this, when something changes, you go into a new part or something like that, the longer it takes for the image to converge again. So if it's 20 seconds and you go into a totally different part, you kind of need to wait 20 seconds for it to adapt, or you press the reset button and then it starts from scratch again, and you can quickly see what has changed or where it is now. Yeah. Did that answer everything?
We have another.
Okay, thanks.
Good.
Great.
Okay, I think we have another online question here. Kellen says, does Christian see this tool replacing or becoming included in the mastering chain?
Not replacing, I guess. I'm not trying to replace anything here. What I'm trying to do is offer a tool and hope that it is useful, and I can see it being really useful in mastering as well, but I don't see it completely replacing anything. But from my point of view, I've obviously, probably I'm the only person in the world that worked with it a bit. I wouldn't say I'm a great musician, but for me it's just a really intuitive way to do it. I would rather use this than a compressor, for example, because I think a compressor is much harder to use and much less flexible. But it has other qualities, like maybe if you have a vintage thingy there, it has some characteristic sound or something like that. So that's what this doesn't have. This is not analog modeling of any kind. So, yeah.
Any other further questions? No?
That's one.
Oh, we got one over there. Okay,
Yeah.
Speak up really loud. And
Assuming it's implemented as a series of compressors and filters, do you have any control over the timing response of those
Okay, yeah.
compressors?
I repeat, assuming it's implemented as a kind of compressor, is there any control on the timing, like attack release? There is a bit. There's this control rate parameter, but it's kind of attack and release. I might add the different attack and release style parameters later, because I'm not sure if it's really needed in this case. But I acknowledge that people are used to having these two controls. I'm curious to see what the feedback in practice is from people using this.
all right, I think Andres comes back with, wouldn't you rather change the dynamics on the track level in terms of a bus instead of doing it on the stereo mix? Did you consider supporting such a multi-track, multi-plugin instance workflow?
Oh, it is. So in the video I've showed, it's just on the drum bus. I could also put it on every channel. So it's just a plugin instance, like a compressor that I can put on every track. And in the music example you've heard there, I have it on every track to put together the mix and place the instruments. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Christian. Any other? Oh, we got another question. Yes.
I think what the question actually meant, at least that's how I understood it, was to have them on individual tracks for analysis reasons. So, for example, you actually build up your histogram from the individual tracks, and then actually have individual control over them, and actually see your overall output.
Yeah.
In the stereo mix, for example, because this is an awesome way to visualize it.
Ah, gotcha. Yeah, sure. So I'm not sure if I want to talk about something like a roadmap, because that one is clearly that idea of kind of combining this over multi-track, but having a unified interface where you can see all instruments and play with all the instrument tracks. That's further in the future than beginning of next year.
All right. One more.
It looks very cool. I'm very interested to play with it. How extreme can you go? Have you kind of found some new? What you played was quite subtle, kind of
Yeah.
manipulation of drum track. Can you do something really extreme? Help one particular velocity really accentuate that, or really?
Yeah, you can. So I'll repeat the question. Can you put this tool to the extreme and do some really weird, let's say, do some weird and drastic things with it? Yes, it is possible to put it in a state where it makes interesting things. So if you put it to the extremes, squeeze different sections very closely to each other, or tear them apart totally, or so it can sound weird and unnatural, and that might also be an application. Yes. I hope so. Maybe it's the next auto-tune. I don't know.
Karanthi says, did you have to look at any kind of source separation to apply this processing, assuming you applied it on multiple instruments at once?
I haven't, because I designed this tool as something that's used during production in a mix, and I already have source separation in that case. Of course, it can be combined with something like that, but I don't plan to integrate source separation into this tool.